Before the silence settled, there had been the click-clack of a small wooden horse on the floorboards. Her husband, Henry, had carved it for their boy, its simple form worn smooth by eager little hands. Now, the horse sat on the mantel, a mute monument to a life that used to be. Eleanor Vance believed she knew every kind of quiet. The stillness of snow, the hush of grief, the emptiness of a hollow house. But she was soon to learn that silence could also arrive as a stranger at the door, carrying with it either the finality of an ending, or the whisper of a beginning she couldn't yet fathom. The wind, in these parts, never came as a friend. It didn't whisper of coming seasons, or carry the warmth of the South. No. The wind here was something older. A hoarse voice rising from the empty plains themselves, telling a constant story of absence. And tonight, it was screaming that story. Just outside Eleanor Vance's homestead. She sat there, in the only embrace left to her. The circle of warmth from the hearth. Her fingers, more accustomed to cold than to kindness, wrapped around a tin cup. Inside wasn't coffee, nor was it tea. Such luxuries had been gone for many winters. Now, there was only the scorched root brew. A familiar bitterness on her tongue. Beyond her windowpane, the world had been erased. The snow didn't dance, it descended. A patient, heavy blanket, slowly tucking everything away. The fence line. The path. Even the memory of green. The roof of the barn seemed to bow. Its timber shoulders stooped under the weight of the sky. In that quiet, a silence that had a physical weight to it. You could believe the heart of the world had finally stopped beating. And sometimes, in the most secret corners of her soul, Eleanor wished it had. She was the keeper of embers in a world gone cold. And she could not remember the last time she'd prayed for the dawn. It was a sound that did not belong. Not the groan of timber settling under the snow. Not the hiss of the fire. It was a tapping at the door. Orderly. Patient. Human. It was the first human sound she had heard in months. And it terrified her. Eleanor's heart, which had been sleeping for years, gave a sudden, painful lurch. Her breath caught in her throat. The world outside was a white grave. Who comes knocking at the door of a tomb? The tapping came again, a measured rhythm. A sound that expected to be answered. She rose, her joints stiff, her movements like those of a ghost in her own home. Her hand, thin and pale, rested on the iron latch. She weighed the slow, quiet end within these walls. Against the sharp, sudden possibility on the other side of the door. She took one breath. And opened it. They were not men so much as figures carved from the winter itself. 7 of them. Their shoulders broad with the weight of furs and the journey they carried. Snow clung to their braids of night black hair. And their eyes held the patience of stone. They did not flinch from the sudden lamplight, nor from her. One stepped forward. The lines on his face told a story of wind and sun and sorrows she could not guess. His voice was like the low rumble of distant thunder. From the storm, he said. The words were not a plea. They were a fact. She looked past him, at the 6 other shadows waiting in the swirling white. They did not look at her with malice, or with hunger. They looked at her as if she, too, were a part of the landscape they needed to pass through. Slowly, she stepped aside. And with their entry, the very air in the cabin shifted. The small space, once filled only with her own solitude, now held the weight of 7 winters, 7 journeys, 7 souls. They did not bring the storm in with them. They brought the quiet of its eye. At the threshold, without a word, without a glance for permission, they shed the frozen mud and snow from their boots. An unspoken gesture of respect. A boundary acknowledged. Her silence had been the silence of a void. Theirs was the silence of the earth. Watchful, and deep, and alive. They moved toward the fire like weary pilgrims toward a shrine. One by one, they knelt or crouched before the hearth. Not speaking, simply absorbing the warmth as if it were a prayer. Some part of Eleanor she thought had died long ago. The part that serves, the part that keeps a home. It stirred. Her hands trembled as she lit another lantern, its glow pushing the shadows back. She ladled what little stew she had into bowls. It was thin, mostly broth and root vegetables, but it was hot. She approached the one who had spoken. The leader. He rose slowly to meet her. When she offered the bowl, he took it. His hand was calloused and scarred, but his touch was lighter than a falling leaf. His eyes met hers for a moment, and in them was not a demand, but an understanding. He gave a slow, single nod. It was more than a thank you. It was a treaty. They ate like men who had known true starvation. Slowly. Deliberately. Wasting nothing. Afterward, the quiet returned, but it had changed again. It was a quiet of shared space. One man sat cross-legged, his fingers nimbly rebraiding his hair. Another drew a piece of bone from a pouch, and with a small knife, began to carve. Eleanor watched them. These were not raiders. These were travelers. Men who carried the horizon in their bones. The pale light of morning arrived like a guest who was afraid to make a sound. It found the cabin changed. The air was thick with the scent of sleeping men and wood smoke. The fire, which she usually found as gray ash, still pulsed with a low, orange heart. One of them had fed it through the night. As quietly as they had come, 6 of them prepared to leave. There was no council held, no grand farewell. They simply rose, gathered their few belongings, and pulled their furs tight around their shoulders. Each one, as they passed her, paused for a moment. They did not speak. They simply met her eyes. And gave the same slow, single nod as their leader had the night before. Then, they stepped back into the white world, and were swallowed by it. One did not leave. The leader. He had not been left behind. He had chosen to remain. He sat by the hearth, watching the flames as if they held the answers to questions he had not yet asked. Eleanor did not ask him why. She found a few dried herbs at the bottom of a tin. The last of them. She steeped them in hot water, creating a pale, fragrant steam. It was a ghost of a tea, but it was an offering. She brought it to him. He took the cup, his gaze moving from the fire to her face. Then, he reached into a pouch at his side. In return, he held out his hand. On his palm lay a small piece of dark wood. He had carved it into the shape of a bird in flight. Its wings spread wide against an unseen wind. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. The carving was smooth, and still warm from his hand. It was not a perfect carving. The lines were simple, marked by a knife that was more tool than artist's blade. But it was alive. She closed her hand around it. A piece of wood, that weighed almost nothing. And in the hollow space inside her chest, she felt the first, tentative beat of something new. He stayed. The sun rose and set. The storm's ghost retreated, leaving behind a world of blinding white and deep blue shadows. And still, he stayed. He did not speak with his voice. He spoke with his hands. Each morning, Eleanor would wake to a new sound. The rhythmic thump of an axe splitting wood with an efficiency that wasted no movement. The scrape of a sagging door being set right on its hinges. He spoke the language of repair. The woodpile outside her cabin grew, a fortress against the cold. The broken fence post that had leaned like a tired old man now stood straight. She watched him from the window, this stranger who owed her nothing. Who was slowly, patiently, mending the broken edges of her world. She had forgotten what safety felt like. It was not a lock on a door. It was the steady sound of another soul working against the decay. They moved around each other in the small cabin, a quiet, unspoken choreography. He would enter from the cold, and she would have a bowl of something warm waiting. She would stoke the fire, and he would have a fresh log ready for her hand. Words felt loud now. Unnecessary. One afternoon, he returned from the tree line, his silhouette dark against the snow. He laid a skinned rabbit on her small wooden table. A silent offering. She looked at the rabbit, then at him. She wanted to ask how he knew her supplies were dwindling, how he knew she hadn't eaten meat in a week. But she already knew the answer. He saw everything. He saw the things she tried to hide. Not to judge them, But to mend them, a false spring had arrived in the air. A crispness that hinted at a thaw, but did not deliver. Eleanor went to the creek to break the ice for water, a chore as old as her time on this land. She did not see the patch of clear ice, a glass jaw hidden beneath a fresh dusting of snow. The world tilted sideways without warning. There was a sharp, brutal crack as her hip met the frozen earth. The breath was stolen from her lungs, and for a moment, all she saw was a sky of indifferent white. She did not call out. There was no one to hear. And then, he was there. He appeared in the silence she had fallen into, kneeling beside her as if he had been summoned by her pain. He did not ask what happened. The story was plain to see. Without a word, his arms went under her, strong and sure, lifting her as if she were a child made of brittle leaves. She was weightless in his arms. She felt the solid wall of his chest against her cheek, shielding her face from the wind's bite. His arms were not just strong, they were a fortress. Inside, he laid her gently by the fire, her own quilts pulled up to her chin. His hands, which could split a log with a single blow, were now impossibly gentle as he removed her snow-caked boot. He tended to her injury with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. He boiled willow bark until the cabin filled with a bitter, healing scent. He touched her only where he must, his movements brief, careful, and without ceremony. Lying there, drifting in a haze of pain and warmth, Eleanor understood. She had seen his strength in the swing of an axe. But this quiet, patient care. This was a strength of a different kind. A deeper kind. The strength that did not break things, but held them together. The pain was still there, a dull echo in her hip, but it was no longer her master. A few days later, she chose to rise. The simple act was a declaration. She would not be a prisoner to her own fragility. In a drawer, beneath linens that smelled of cedar and disuse, she found a small hand mirror. She had not looked at her own face in years. The woman who looked back at her was a stranger. Her face was thinner, etched with hardship. But her eyes were not hollow anymore. They held a steady light. She was no longer a ghost haunted by her own home. She was the keeper of it. From a chest at the foot of her bed, she pulled out a ribbon of deep crimson silk. A relic from another life. With fingers that were now steady, she tied it in her hair. The slip of color was a rebellion against the gray. When he came in from the cold, he did not speak of it. But his eyes paused on the ribbon for a heartbeat longer than usual. A silent acknowledgement. A quiet approval. That evening, the fire danced, and the silence between them was soft and comfortable, like a well-worn blanket. The question had been living in her heart for weeks. It finally found its way to her lips, soft as a breath. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you stay?" He looked up from the flames, his face half in shadow, half in light. He considered her question, not as if it were an accusation, but as if it were a fragile thing he needed to handle with care. "You never told me to go," he said. His answer was so simple, yet it filled the entire cabin. It was an answer that held everything. Respect, patience, and the quiet truth of their shared existence. His answer settled in the quiet spaces of the cabin and became a part of it. The following days, something new took root. She found herself working alongside him. Her hands, at first clumsy, helped him stretch a new hide over a broken frame. They moved in that comfortable silence, their shared rhythm a conversation in itself. One afternoon, a log she was carrying slipped from her grasp and rolled clumsily into a deep snowdrift. She looked at the log, then at him, a dusting of snow on her cheek. A slow smile spread across his face, lighting his eyes from within. And then, he laughed. A low, quiet sound she had never heard. A sound of unexpected warmth. And hearing it, something broke loose inside her. She laughed too. A sound rusty from disuse, but real. In that moment, for the first time, the cabin was not a shelter from a storm. It was a home. That night, as he unrolled his furs by the fire, she stopped him. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "There is a bed," she said. "In the loft." He went still, his eyes searching hers in the firelight. He saw the truth of her offer. It was not about comfort. It was about acceptance. About permanence. He did not argue. He did not question. He simply gave that single, slow nod. The one that had become his most eloquent word. Eleanor lay in her own bed that night, listening. Not to the wail of the wind. But to the faint, steady sound of another's breathing from the loft above. The house was no longer empty. It was full. And for the first time in 5 years. She felt the deep, profound peace of being safe. A peace she did not know was about to be tested. Peace is a fragile thing. It can be undone by something as small as a mark in the snow. He found them at dawn, near the tree line. 3 sets of tracks, not his own. Made by shod horses, and men who walked with a heavy, arrogant gait. They had not approached the house. Not yet. They had only watched from a distance. A silent, hungry observation. When he returned to the cabin, the peace of the morning was gone from his eyes. He did not speak of what he saw. He did not have to. The stillness in him had changed. It was no longer the quiet of a calm river. But the stillness of a coiled snake. Eleanor saw it instantly. She felt a cold dread snake its way around her heart, chilling the warmth that had so recently bloomed there. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He met her gaze, and the truth was stark and bare in his eyes. "We are no longer alone," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. The safety she had felt just the night before. Dissolved like smoke. The wind had returned. And this time, it was whispering the names of men. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer a blanket of comfort. But a held breath. He sat by the fire, but not for warmth. In his hands, a whetstone and his long knife. The sound was a low, steady whisper of steel against stone. A sound that spoke of finality. It was the only sound in the room. Eleanor watched him. Then, she turned and walked to the old wooden chest that sat at the foot of her bed. From beneath a folded quilt, she pulled out her husband's rifle. The oil and steel felt cold and alien in her hands. It smelled of a past she had buried. Holding it did not make her feel strong. It made her feel weary. "We could leave," she said, the words tasting like surrender. "Go north. Disappear." He did not stop the steady movement of his hands. "Men like that," he said, his voice even. "Their hunger follows." He paused, and looked around the small room. At the mended door, at the warm hearth, at her. "This place," he said. "It is a good place. Good places must be defended." She walked to the door and leaned the rifle against the wall. Not hidden, but ready. A statement. He looked at her, then at the rifle, and gave that single, slow nod. The treaty between them was now an alliance. They did not have to wait long. Out on the horizon, where the white snow met the gray sky, 3 dark figures appeared. They were coming. They rode with the slow arrogance of men who believe the world belongs to them. 2 were followers, their faces dull and mean. The one in the lead was their core, a man whose cruelty was etched into the lines around his mouth. He stopped his horse a few yards from the porch, his eyes taking in the repaired fence, the stacked firewood, and finally, Eleanor, standing in the doorway. He looked past her, at the shadow of the man standing just inside. "Well now, Eleanor," the leader sneered. "Playing house with a stray? You have no business here, Jed," she said, her voice colder than the air. "This is our business," he spat. "A woman alone. You get notions. We're here to remind you of your place." The youngest of them, his hand twitching on his shotgun, took a step forward. "Just want the redskin," he stammered. "Then we'll be on our way." That was when the man beside Eleanor moved. He stepped out of the shadow of the doorway and onto the porch. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood there. His presence was a challenge. A wall. It happened not with a bang, but with a twitch. The young one's nerve broke. He raised the shotgun. But he was too slow. The man who had stayed was not a man anymore. He was lightning. He flowed across the snow, a river of controlled force. There was no anger in his movement. Only a terrible, swift purpose. The shotgun fired into the empty sky as its owner went down, his cry swallowed by the snow. The second man drew a knife, lunging forward. And the cabin roared. The rifle bucked in Eleanor's hands, a brutal sound that shattered the winter quiet. She did not aim for a man. She aimed to break their certainty. The bullet splintered the porch rail a hand's breadth from the leader's head. He flinched. It was all the time that was needed. Steel met steel. A brief, sharp sound. A grunt of pain. The second man was on his knees, clutching his arm, his knife lost in the snow. Now, the leader, Jed, stood alone. His bravado stripped away, leaving only a pale, shivering fear. The man who had defended her home turned to face him. He was not breathing hard. His knife was clean. His eyes were as cold and final as the winter earth. His voice was low, but it cut through the air. "Go," he said. The man turned and scrambled for his horse, a coward fleeing the consequences he had invited. He left his friends where they lay. And then, there was silence once more. A silence filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sight of blood on pure white snow. He did not look at the fallen men. He walked to her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of fear. She was not trembling. Her hands were steady on the rifle. He stopped before her, and she could see the storm of the fight receding from his eyes, leaving behind the deep, familiar calm. She reached out a hand, not to the man, but to the rifle he had faced. She gently took it from her. He laid it aside, a tool whose work was done. "I am not ashamed," she said, her voice clear in the cold air. "Of this. Of you." He looked down at her hand, which still rested on his arm. He covered it with his own. "I would have died for this place," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard before. She met his gaze, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "You did not die," she answered softly. "You lived for it." He leaned his forehead against hers. A shared moment of quiet understanding, of a battle fought and won. The wind still blew, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like the turning of a page. Later, after the injured men had been tied to their horse and sent away with a silent, final warning, he stood looking out at the trampled, blood-stained snow. She came to stand beside him. "The snow will cover it," she said. He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "The ground will remember. Then we will give it something new to remember," she replied. "We will rebuild the fence tomorrow." He turned to look at her then, and for the first time, a true smile reached his eyes. Not the brief laugh of an afternoon, but a deep, knowing smile that spoke of a future. Behind them, the smoke from their chimney rose straight and steady into the vast, quiet sky. A signal. Not of distress, but of life. A promise of warmth, tended to and defended. A home.